So, how did World War II affect life in the United States? Well, for one, um, it officially ended the Great Depression, while the New Deal had been bringing us out of the Great Depression slowly but surely. You can truly say that the Great Depression ended immediately after Pearl Harbor. America experienced pretty much universal employment. Unlike the rest of the world, which was ravaged by World War II, pretty much every major industrialized country had been either destroyed or had sustained some pretty significant damage. America emerged from World War II the world's leading economic superpower, and we were basically untouched by the war. Um, World War II, gentlemen, created 19 million jobs. As I said, you practically had universal employment. You have to remember, too, not only did we create 19 million jobs, but you had millions of men who went off to fight overseas or were in the military, serving here at home but not able to work in the private sector. So you had a dramatic increase in the number of job opportunities. You had a significant decrease in the number of white males available to fill those jobs. And this suddenly created numerous job opportunities for women and minority groups. So first we'll look at the what happened with women. In World War II, you're going to see a lot of women, around 2.5 million of them ending up working in industry. First, let's mention not every woman went off to work in a shipyard or in an aircraft factory or anything of that nature. That is the contribution of women that gets kind of the most coverage, so to speak. But, for example, 4 million women were hired by the United States government to serve in mostly clerical positions. Now, at first glance, that doesn't seem like a great contribution to some folks, but when you think about the sheer bureaucracy, the amount of paperwork, record keeping, all the sort of stuff that's necessary when you are fighting a total war effort like we are with millions of men in the field, you need a lot of staff to keep things organized. And as we get talking with this, with the things like the rationing and such, you had to keep records in an era before computers, which required a lot of manpower or workers. So women helped in that way. But as I said, a lot of women ended up working in industry. Now, some of these were young, single ladies who were taking advantage of a good job opportunity. Some of them were married women with children who needed the work to actually help provide for their families. The famous example is Rosie the Riveter, who is actually the lady on this poster. Her name is not actually Rosie. She was a female rivet worker in a factory. It's based off a real person. But the actual woman was not named Rosie. It was just convenient to have that alliteration. But all women who worked in military production factories were known as WOWs, Women Ordnance Workers. And there was quite the effort to recruit them. This photograph right here shows, a Wendy the welder, as some, not everybody liked to be called a Rosie the Riveter, depending on their job. But for example, this young lady is a welder in what is a shipyard. And she's doing some stick welding, posing for the camera. A few other examples. Here's another female welder. Here are some women driving rivets into an airplane fuselage in a factory. One thing about a lot of these photos is they are staged. Having been a welder, I can tell you no welder's face is that immaculately clean when they've been at work for any amount of time. Now, that was critical. If you think about it, if you're going to recruit women to do some of these jobs, which are very laborious, they're very physical, they're very dirty, you have to make them believe that they are not going to lose their femininity. That was a concern amongst women. Like I said, some of these ladies, they were housewives, they were mothers, they were married, their husband was away, and they didn't want to lose their identity as a woman or lose, what it meant to be female. And so one of the things that was done in recruiting posters or pictures for, to get women to go to work was to make sure that they always, they always were very clean, their clothes were unblemished, they didn't have any dirt on their face or anything, because that helped make women think that, oh, it won't be so bad. I'll just go do, this work and help out with the war effort, make some money. It'll be all right. Not every woman was excited to do this, I will say, because the jobs aren't necessarily fun or enjoyable. It was necessity. But when you think about it, when a lot of the men went away, it's not that they didn't get paid in the United States military, but the military doesn't pay very well. And so now these women found themselves, they have bills to pay, their husband is away, he is not making as much money as he used to, and you still got to pay those bills, you still got to feed the kids. So some women did it out of necessity. My maternal grandmother worked in a shipyard outside of New Orleans building landing craft at the Higgins Boatyard, the ships that helped transport the men on D-Day. She basically went to work. She left her eldest daughter, my aunt, at home to take care of the younger children while she went and worked at the Higgins Boatyard. She had to do this because she still had bills to pay, and my maternal grandfather was away in the Army in the Pacific. So that is a real-life example of a person who had never really worked before in their life, but they had to make money. It was a decent paying job. It was in the area where she lived, and she was able to make it work. And the minute she didn't have to work in that boatyard, she quit. She did not enjoy it. It's not something she relished. It was just something she did during that time. Now, another group, and your book mentioned, African Americans. African Americans were also hired. Of course, there was the usual racial discrimination that they had experienced previously. Franklin Roosevelt actually dealt with this. Your book mentioned. He issued a presidential executive order, Executive Order 8802, in June of 1941. So before Pearl Harbor had even occurred, in this executive order, he said there would be no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries based on race. So even before Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt realized the importance of the factories running efficiently and smoothly and having all the workers available, and we did not have time for racism to play into the matter. And so he used the office of the presidency to try and bring an end to racial discrimination, at least in factories that were producing weapons for the government. Another group of workers who contributed, thanks to the Bracero Program, were Hispanics, Mexicans actually. In 1942, the United States government started Bracero. Bracero is the Spanish word for worker. The Bracero Program was a program where the government basically recruited and transported thousands of Mexicans across the border to work in certain industries, generally working on ranches, mining operations, and in agriculture, particularly in harvesting. With all of the men being drafted and volunteering for service, there was a dramatic shortage of workers to keep the agricultural industries of the American West and Southwest going. And so the United States government began recruiting people to come across the border and work. Now, they were generally sent home at the end of the season. This was not like a permanent visa or green card program. The idea was, they would basically say, hey, we need people for 3 months to go work in the San Fernando Valley or whatever. People would volunteer, they would do it, they would get paid very well, and when the work was done, they were put on a bus and they were sent home. This actually was so helpful to everyone that Bracero lasted until 1964. Yes, almost 20 years after World War II ended, we were still recruiting Mexican workers to come to the United States to work as cheap agricultural labor in the American West. So the tradition or pattern of migrant workers in this part of the country, primarily coming from Mexico or even further south, is something that sort of started with the blessing of the United States government during World War II to answer a labor shortage. Now, it wasn't just temporary workers coming from Mexico that were making population shifts in the United States. One major population shift that we saw was the rise of a region we call the Sun Belt. It is a general term for the part of the country, basically the Deep South out west. So think, South Carolina, go west, go across Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and Texas and out into some of the western states. That is what we tend to call the Sun Belt region, the Southwest and the Deep South of the United States. This was a rapidly growing region of the United States during World War II for a number of reasons. For one reason, the West had a boom during this period because the war with Japan, I'm not going to say demanded, but encouraged industry to get as close to the coast as they could. If whatever you make is going to be shipped across the Pacific to fight World War II against the Japanese, it makes sense to make it as close to the Pacific as you can to cut your costs and to streamline the process. So you saw a great increase in the amount of manufacturing opportunities in California, LA, San Diego, some in Washington State, the shipyards of Washington State, up in Puget Sound, for example. Things of that nature, they really grew dramatically. And obviously, people went where the jobs were. Not every person had a booming defense industry plant in their backyard. Some people realized that in order to take advantage of the job opportunities created by World War II, they would have to move. And so it was during World War II that you saw the Sun Belt become the fastest growing region of the United States, which has remained the case to this very day. This part of the country has consistently been the fastest growing in population. Although I guess California has somewhat changed that trend as of late, as people are fleeing the state of California. But with the exception of California, pretty much the Sun Belt is the fastest growing part of the United States. It actually marked the first time since the Industrial Revolution that the South and West were the leading areas of both urban growth and industrial growth in our country. There was also a renewed Great Migration, or you could call it a new Great Migration or second Great Migration. Again, the movement of African Americans out of the Deep South towards some of these new job opportunities in the northern cities and, in some cases, in the American West or Southwest. The Great Depression had kind of ended the Great Migration. The Great Migration that we witnessed during World War I had continued into the 20s, but with the Great Depression, it had basically come to an end because the jobs that had once produced the Great Migration were no longer available. So there was nothing to migrate to. There was nowhere to go. And so you saw basically an end to the migration of African Americans. And the Second World War and all these new industrial job opportunities renewed that movement of people out of the South. Now, that is going to lead to some issues and some tensions. As we had with the first Great Migration, and I gave you examples, for example, the riot in Chicago in the summer of 1919, we are going to have race riots. There are going to be a lot of issues with these influxes of minority populations into what had once been predominantly white cities or neighborhoods. The worst one of World War II took place in June of 1943 in Detroit, Michigan, which was a very significant city of American industry during World War II. Some people called it the heart and soul of America's industrial miracle because basically the vast bulk of vehicles like trucks and Jeeps and such rolled off of lines in and around Detroit. But anyhow, there was a massive race riot that ripped through the city. When it all was said and done, 25 African Americans and 9 whites had been killed and countless others injured and property destroyed, fires and buildings damaged and looting. There were a few others in other cities, but Detroit is perhaps the most famous. Before I move on to another famed example of tension and rioting, I do have to mention, underlying some of these incidents was the fact that there was a massive housing crisis in America. You know, when all of these people started moving to the Sun Belt or moving to all these other locations, it's not like we had housing waiting for them. We built a factory. We didn't build houses. And so you'd have hundreds, thousands of workers and perhaps their families coming into regions, and there were no homes for them to move into, and there were no schools for their children to go to. And, you know, they quickly overwhelmed the infrastructure. You know, there weren't enough doctors, there weren't enough dentists, there weren't enough anything to support all these people. And so you saw a real housing crisis that the government had to try and resolve. During World War II, the U.S. government spent $1.2 billion trying to build public housing, public schools, and community centers to provide for workers. In some cases, people had to live for a time in surplus army tents while public housing was being constructed. So there were some small, I won't call them tent cities, but they looked like army encampments for industrial workers because there was nowhere to put them. Some people were, you know, they were cramming multiple families into what is basically a mobile home or a trailer. And of course, this led to a lot of tension. You know, nearly 2 million people lived in government-built housing during the war. And they lived in government-built housing not because they were poor. They had decent-paying jobs. There was just nowhere for them to live. And that kind of would help also explain, you know, for example, the Detroit riot. There was a housing shortage in Detroit for African Americans. They were, because of de facto discrimination in the housing community and in the way houses were sold and property was rented in Detroit, there were only a few places where African Americans could live, and there simply wasn't enough room. And so that was a bit of tension, which of course added to other issues and boiled over into a massive riot. Speaking of riots, one of the other famed incidents that took place in America was the Zoot Suit riot. Now, first I have to explain what the Zoot Suit is. The Zoot Suit was a fashion statement during this time period. It was kind of a large, baggy, flashy outfit. Here's an example. As you can see, baggy pants, a jacket that is way longer than it needs to be, a lapel and collar and stuff that are way wider. Basically, you've just got all sorts of stuff all over the place. And it, in the eyes of many Americans, represented a gaudy waste of valuable material. I know when we think of resources to fight a war, we think iron, we think oil, you know, but cloth and fabric also became important and needed. And the idea that somebody was running around in this costume, as some people viewed it, they saw it as unpatriotic. And this especially was offensive to, you know, hardworking, patriotic Americans who had sacrificed traditional fashion to wear the victory suit. So if the Zoot Suit is big and baggy and kind of all over the place, the victory suit is the opposite. It is a bare bones suit. It is a slim, trim-fitting suit, no cuffs in the pant, very narrow lapel. There is no vest. It's not a three-piece suit. It is simply a jacket and slacks, so you forego the vest, which had been pretty much a staple of menswear up to that point. A narrow necktie. And the idea was you were conserving fabric. You were wearing basically the least fabric you could wear and still wear a suit. And so you had Americans wearing victory suits who were offended at teenagers who in Los Angeles were primarily Hispanic teenagers who were wearing Zoot Suits. So that was an underlying bit of tension which boiled over. So, you know, these Hispanic teenagers already had a reputation or stereotype that they weren't patriotic because they were wearing these Zoot Suits. That boiled over in the summer of 1943, that there were rumors that some Zoot Suit wearing Hispanic teenagers had attacked some American sailors in LA on shore leave. In response, about 2,500 soldiers, sailors, Marines went into the Mexican-American neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and they attacked Mexican teenagers. Um, they forcibly cut their hair because many of them were wearing what today we would call kind of like a small mullet. Back then it was called a ducktail. They cut off their zoot suits. They thoroughly abused these people, and the Los Angeles Police Department did not intervene. They just kind of sat back and let it happen. Here's an example of some of the club or stick wielding soldiers and sailors on the prowl looking for some Hispanic teenagers. Here are some of the unfortunate victims, as you can see, beaten, and this one literally the clothes cut off his body or ripped off his body. To try and prevent this from happening again, the Los Angeles city government banned the Zoot Suit after this. It actually was a crime to wear the Zoot Suit. You'd be ticketed, fined, etc. Contrary, though, to this event, Mexican Americans and Hispanics in general supported the war effort and served their country. About 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the military in World War II. About 400,000 of them were Mexican Americans. Another 65,000 or so were Puerto Ricans. They fought in all the campaigns. They fought in North Africa, in Europe, in the Pacific. 17 Mexican Americans received the Medal of Honor during World War II. So I realize that some of these teenagers got a bad rap, but in general, the Mexican population of the United States supported the war effort like every other demographic group. Now, while these poor kids had it bad, they did not have it quite as bad as another group of Americans, Japanese Americans. Most Americans in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor immediately saw all Asians as the enemy. And they looked at all Japanese Americans with great suspicion. And there were many people who believed that the only way Pearl Harbor could have happened was it was an inside job. That there had been help, that there had been spies, saboteurs, that's the only way they could have pulled that one off. And so there was a lot of distrust of Japanese Americans by the public at large, and even some people in the government and in the military. Now, there were rumors of Japanese spies and saboteurs, and they started to face violence, and they started to face discrimination. Your book mentioned banks refused to do business with them, cash their checks, to give them loans. Stores stopped serving them or selling them. Grocery stores refused to sell them food. Restaurants refused to serve them. People began to ban their businesses. People began to loot or vandalize their businesses and homes. And eventually, President Roosevelt had to bow down or give in to the intense pressure he was receiving from both the military and the public to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And so on February 19th, 1942, he issued an executive order in which he allowed the War Department, which today we would call the Department of Defense, but back then it was called the War Department, to declare any part of the United States a military zone and to then be able to remove anybody they wanted from that zone. Secretary of War Henry Stimson declared basically the West Coast a military zone, as well as Hawaii, and ordered all people of Japanese ancestry to be evacuated to 10 internment campsites located primarily in the western United States, but not all of them in the western United States. What is an internment camp? Well, it's like a concentration camp. It's the same concept as a concentration camp in the idea of you're just going to cram a lot of people in a small space. Here's a map of where they were all located. So not to get too deep into it, but the dots were places where you were supposed to assemble, right? So, all of the Japanese Americans in San Francisco, they got a letter and they were told to go here, and then they were transported to one of these triangles. One of these triangles was basically where you were going. So there were some in Arizona, a few of them in Eastern California, and then a few people, I don't know why or how, got shipped all the way to Arkansas. But I have one here, and here's a picture of one. This is an actual internment camp that we built for Japanese citizens, Japanese American citizens, I should say. As I put on here, it's like scout camp with barbed wire. And I put that on there because if any of us have ever been to camp, camps kind of look like this. You got the long rectangular buildings, and everybody kind of has bunk beds, and you share stuff. And there's a baseball field, and there's like a rec center, and there might be a movie theater. It's like scout camp, except it's surrounded by barbed wire, and you can't leave. It's not a concentration camp in the sense of we aren't going to put these people to work as slaves. We're not trying to kill these people, but we are putting them in basically a giant prison camp. They have schools for their children to go to. They have, like I said, they have baseball fields for their kids to play baseball. There are theaters. There's stuff to try and make their stay comfortable, but they are prisoners. Now, not everybody, of course, took this well. In fact, one man, Fred Korematsu, sued for his freedom, saying that his rights had been violated. His case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1944, in the case of Korematsu v. the United States, as you can see here, the Supreme Court ruled that the relocation of Japanese Americans to these camps was constitutional because it was based not on their race, but on military urgency. I will point out the court did say that loyal American citizens could not be held against their will, though. And so in early 1945, the government began to release Japanese Americans from these camps. It's a little too late at that point, honestly. Not to mention, they did nothing to show their disloyalty previously when you lock them up. So that goes to, for all the rumors, for all the fear, for all the concerns, not a single Japanese American was ever arrested and tried for espionage or sabotage during the entire Second World War. Not a single incident occurred. Now, okay, they weren't spies and saboteurs. Did they support the war? Yes, they did. Japanese Americans served in the United States military. They served as translators. They also, some of them served as translators in the Pacific for the military. They did not allow Japanese Americans to serve in actual combat in the Pacific for obvious reasons, that there was fear of mix-up and friendly fire and confusion in the ranks, and still a little bit of fear of spies, etc. Japanese Americans did serve in Europe. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought against the Germans in Europe in World War II, was the most highly decorated unit of all of World War II. They won more medals of valor than any unit in the United States Army in World War II. It was made up entirely of Japanese Americans. Many of them, their parents were in these very camps while they were fighting against the Nazis in Europe. So I think that makes the case that they were loyal and supported the war. After the war, Japanese Americans who had lost property and such because of this did try and fight for compensation. While you're in this camp, you are not making money, so you are not able to pay your bills. You're not able to pay rent or your mortgage. So you're going to lose your home. If you had a business, you're probably going to lose that. You're going to lose everything. So not only did you go to prison for a while, when you get out, everything you had is gone, basically. Eventually, in 1988, President Reagan apologized to these people and signed a law granting $20,000 to each survivor who had actually been in the camps. So they did get a apology payment 40 plus years after they went to these prison camps. So we admitted that was a mistake on our part, but the damage had been done. But again, they fought with distinction in World War II, despite what was being done to them. So I went ahead and looked it up really quickly. 21 men in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team slash the 100th Battalion, as your book mentioned. 21 of them received the Medal of Honor in World War II fighting in Europe. So, what about the rest of us who weren't fighting and who weren't in an internment camp? Well, You have to think about the economic implications of war. As we've talked about in this class, usually war causes inflation for a variety of reasons, but generally you're going to experience inflation during a war. And with inflation, that could easily wipe out any of the economic gains that the war provided us. You know, we've got universal employment basically. Everybody's got a job. Everybody's making money. The depression should be over. Everything should be good when this is over, provided that we win the war. If we don't keep inflation under control, that will all be wiped out, and the economy will emerge from this war probably in worse shape than when it entered the war. That is why you need government control of the prices and government control over wages. And those were the jobs of the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. The OPA controlled the price for all non-farm goods, or as I put up here, not food. So basically, anything that wasn't food, prices were set, max prices were set by the OPA. The Office of Economic Stabilization controlled all prices and wages for all farm-related goods. So anything food or animal food, meat, poultry, whatever, that would come through the OES. Now, also like in World War I, we cannot afford any labor shortages or labor stoppages. And so we do not bring back the National War Labor Board. This time we just call it the War Labor Board. It's the same concept, though. It is a government organization, and their job is to try and keep the workers from going on strike and to resolve disputes between workers and companies. Their answer was usually give the workers what they want, although I will say that many unions at the start of World War II, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, many of the unions in this country issued a no-strike pledge where they promised they would not go on strike during the war. Now, that doesn't mean that companies could do whatever they wanted, but these unions basically made it clear that they expected to be treated fairly, and in return, they would not go on strike. And so the War Labor Board stepped in, and as your book mentioned, they helped settle over 17,000 separate labor disputes in this country during World War II. Now, we had to ration in World War II. We were able to avoid rationing in World War I, if you remember. We were able to produce enough through voluntary methods. That's not the case in World War II. World War II is so encompassing and so needy. We are basically keeping England alive. We are going to end up sending enormous amounts of stuff to the Russians, to the Chinese, to Australia. We're really the only game in town for the non-Axis powers. So we ended up having to send our stuff all over the globe. So we had to ration during this war. The government had to set limits on how much stuff you could buy. And this was done through a system where every person in America, well, let me phrase this, every household in America received a ration book. Okay? So you would get from, as you can even see there, if you look in closely, here, let's do this little fun feature. If you look in closely, from the Office of Price Administration, okay, there you go. You got, from the OPA, you got your book for food. Well, this is actually not for food. I apologize. The book I just showed you is for non-food items. You got a different book from the OES, all right? But you would get these books, and inside these books would be your coupons. These are examples of what I'm talking about, okay? This is like stamps. Now I realize that stamps are stickers now that you just pull off a sticker sheet. But when I was a kid, which wasn't that long ago, stamps were like on these big perforated sheets, and you would tear one off when you needed one. That's how these coupons were designed. So what you would do is you would go to Kroger, and let's say you wanted to buy a pound of ground beef. You would go to the cash register. There was whatever the price was. You would have to pay with money, but the clerk would also require you to peel off the appropriate amount of meat stamps, or in this case, red coupons. So out of your book, you would pull out, let's say you needed one stamp for 1 pound. You would pull out a meat stamp, and you'd have to give that to the clerk in order to be able to purchase your product. And as I have up here, you had different colored stamps and different types of stamps for different products. The examples I have up here, for example, these were some stamps that you would use to buy coffee. I think this is what you used to buy gas, actually. These were your stamps in order to be able to get gas. So this was a way to make sure that we did not overindulge. Now, it was not one size fits all. Obviously, the larger your household, the larger your family, the more you got. No one went hungry. I don't want you to think that people in America starved during World War II. Everyone had plenty to eat. But this was a way to make sure that you weren't wasteful, right? People had enough, but they weren't rolling in it, right? And so it was based on the size of your household. I'm sure somebody, if we were in class, what if you cheated? There were ways to check up and make sure. The census, which is going to go on this year. I mean, the government has a general idea of who's in what household and such. And also, everybody was pretty patriotic and supportive of the war. There wasn't a whole lot of cheating. And like I said, no one's going hungry. So there wasn't really a need to cheat. But anyhow, everybody had one. And it was enough. When it came to certain things, there was a national speed limit of 35 miles per hour. I know that seems silly, the idea that would lead to less wear on tires and on brakes, which would mean we would go through rubber and brake parts less. And that's more of that stuff to go around. We did limit how much gas you could purchase, so we rationed everything. Now, in the case of food, if you would like to eat more food, you could do like we did in World War I. We encouraged people to do victory gardens again. Plant vegetables in the backyard. Make a vegetable garden on the top of your apartment building. Have the local school, plant a garden outside somewhere for the kids to tend. And that could be some way that they could participate and contribute to the war effort. Speaking of raw materials, scrap drives. I mean, it was very common for, again, elementary schools or high schools to basically encourage kids to, instead of a canned food drive, just collect the cans, to collect scrap metal, to turn in their old bikes they're not using anymore so they can be turned into some sort of weaponry. There was even a way where you could exchange bacon grease and meat drippings in exchange for extra coupons. Because the oils and fats that came, those byproducts of cooking those foods was actually useful in making explosives. And so that was a way for you to actually earn more food coupons if you brought your bacon grease drippings to the War Production Board for them to distribute. And so these are all examples of ways that people on the home front contributed. People thought that they were helping win the war by turning in their old rusty bike they weren't using anymore, or picking up empty soup cans and bringing a box full of those to the local WPB office. Now, World War II was not cheap. World War II cost this country roughly $300 billion in their money. In today's money, I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but here, I will look it up. Okay, so I just plugged $300 billion into my inflation calculator, and I set it at 1945. So obviously, we have a little flexibility here. But $300 billion in 1945 money is the equivalent in 2019 money of $4,323,702,722,078.87. So in our world, I'm thinking that World War II cost us $4 trillion. Now, that $300 billion price tag that they actually faced in their world, in their time, that was more money than we spent from the day that George Washington took the oath of office to become president of the United States, all the way through FDR's second term. So basically, up until the end of 1940. Now, to put that in perspective, in that time period, I've listed a handful of events that took place. We purchased Louisiana. We fought the War of 1812, the Mexican War. We made the Gadsden Purchase. We fought a national civil war. We bought Alaska, Spanish-American War. As we have already learned, we fought World War I, which World War I cost more than all of these things combined, right? Oh, and then we had that New Deal thing where we kept burning money every time we turned around. So you add up all of these things, and they weren't as expensive as fighting 4 years of World War II. So how did we pay for this enormously expensive undertaking? Well, we did two things. First of all, we raised taxes. Now, unfortunately for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Congress was not about to hike taxes near as high as he wanted to hike taxes. As a result, we only got about 45% of the war covered through tax revenue. So we got close to half, not quite half. The other way we paid for World War II was through selling bonds, which we've learned about. It's basically you give a loan to the government. You know, you give them money and they tell you, we'll pay you back with X amount of interest. The most famous example of a government bond that you could get in World War II was an E-bond. There were different classes of bonds. They just had a letter. That's all. You know, there's an H bond. There's a T bond. The E bond was a very popular bond. You paid $18.75, right? So you bought the bond for $18.75. You were able to redeem it. You could cash that in for $25 10 years after you bought it. That works out to 33% interest over a 10-year period, which is a substantial amount of interest. That is really impressive, to be honest. And, you know, unlike the stock market where there's fluctuations, you're guaranteed to make that interest. And so it was a very popular investment. Americans, individuals, bought $50 billion worth of bonds. Institutions in this country, by that I mean banks, corporations, investment firms, those sorts of things, they bought over $100 billion worth of bonds. And so through tax increases and bond sales, we actually had enough money on hand to pay for World War II. Now, I do know that somebody is probably thinking, we're going to have to pay this money back. Like you just said that in a handful of years, we're going to owe people money. Yes, we will. But the theory at the time was, we'll figure that out. I mean, honestly, whenever the government sells you a bond, the government is doing two things. The government is banking on the idea that actually inflation will overtake your bond interest rate. Secondly, they will magically come up with an answer. So that is kind of what we did rolling into World War II. We knew that we were going to be putting a lot on the credit card, and we were really hoping that we'd be able to pay it off in the long run. Despite all of this, America got through World War II, and we got through it way better than everybody else. We were a fairly united country. World War II was probably the most supported conflict this country has ever gone through, where everybody seemed on the same page. And part of that was, of course, the way we got suckered into it. I shouldn't say suckered, sucked into it. But I would also say, hey, propaganda, it's always there. The United States government was very good at promoting, supporting the war through propaganda. This is my absolute favorite one. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. This was a poster encouraging people to carpool. Save gas, conserve gas, combine trips. You're driving to work, your neighbor works at the same place, ride together. So they did a little throw Hitler in there. There was a lot of that in World War II. I realize that you guys are familiar with Hitler reaction videos, and the Hitler memes and etc. Long before people were taking that clip from the movie Downfall where Hitler flips out, and changing the subtitles. Hitler was getting poked fun of in American propaganda. Adolf Hitler did appear, as I will show you, in some cartoons. He was in posters, but this is my absolute favorite one, just because it's like so weird. This is one, of course, reminding people to keep up production and war bonds, just reminding them that what is happening in Europe, good cap in here. This was one to get you to buy war bonds. So this Japanese soldier is going to cut the throat of this poor American woman if we don't buy war bonds. This was one to encourage women to become WOWs, women ordnance workers, right? So she's working to build stuff so they can fight. Again, buy war bonds, or these scary Nazi and Japanese hands are going to hurt this poor woman and her baby. The famed loose lips might sink ships. The old expression, loose lips sink ships, you just have to be careful. You can't be careless. I realized that we had that gentleman who came and spoke to you all about, we'll call it cybersecurity for lack of a better term. That was a real issue in World War II. Just because there was the issue of spies. You're at the bar and you think you're just having a very generic conversation, with your buddy, but you don't realize the guy on the bar stool behind you is listening. He's taking notes, and you're talking about this upcoming shipment that's going to Europe and blah blah blah. That tells the U-boats a convoy is coming. A soldier might be out. He might mention how, they say we're shipping out soon, we're going to be going to such and such. That tells the enemy reinforcements are coming. And so that was the motto of just, be careful what you say, what you do, and what you put in letters, etc. This was one for, conserve your tires, because these guys have more important places to go. Yes, don't tell her anything. She could be an enemy agent. That was a real poster from World War II. Yep, someone talked, and this guy's ship got torpedoed, and now he's drowning. The back the attack expression. That was a one expression or phrase for selling war bonds. You could back the attack, buy war bonds. I mentioned cartoons. There was a very, I'm not going to say super popular, but there was a pretty popular cartoon series that came out in World War II, Private Snafu. Snafu is an acronym that the clean version is situation normal, all fouled up. So that is what snafu stands for. I'm sure some of you can probably modify that to your heart's content. But that was an expression kind of referring to the idea that things in the military never go as planned. So it's a normal situation when it's all messed up. But this cartoon series, this Private Snafu, was a mess up. And the whole point of the cartoon series is he makes all sorts of mistakes, and it's kind of funny, and it shows you what you should not do. Like there's an episode where, of course, he's talking to his girl, his girl back home. He doesn't know the Germans are listening, and they're taking all sorts of notes, and they know everything, and all sorts of careless mistakes. So there were cartoons about World War II. Speaking of cartoons about World War II, yes, Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes had cartoons that involved Nazis, and of course they made fun of the Nazis and beat up the Nazis. Here's one where Donald Duck ends up, being one of the Nazis, etc. I mean, there were Looney Tunes, there were Disney cartoons. They weren't necessarily geared towards children. I mean, some of them were. Some of them were clearly more to be entertainment for adults, kind of like Family Guy is in modern day America. I don't know how many little children would get the jokes in that show. But there were actual, Bugs Bunny cartoons with swastikas in them in World War II. The propaganda was everywhere, reinforcing and building that support that spread across the country. In our next video, we are going to cover Section 4, where we are going to really start to drive we've stopped the advance of the Japanese at Midway. We're going to start pushing them back. And the Germans, we already began to push them back, but we're really going to start driving them back to their borders. We're going to have D-Day, etc. So that'll all be in our next video where we will cover Section 4.